The PlayStation 3 exclusive JRPG, Ni no Kuni, Wrath of the White Witch, may be gorgeous, but its beauty goes so much deeper than mere aesthetics. The game does something bold and unexpected. It defines itself by staying true to its JRPG roots, a genre that's been mostly floundering for years.
Are you sure about that?
The year is 2013. Mainstream media thinks JRPGs are dead, and suddenly have been since 1997. The 360 had been king of the 720 for almost 9 years, and we were about to transition into the 8th generation of consoles.
Xbox, go home.
And what I remember most was the obnoxious amount of doomsaying from every direction. Not just that the Japanese industry was dying, but that these new machines weren't gonna sell, that they were never gonna stick the landing, and console gaming would be replaced by Temple Run. Shout out to Temple Run. But while the West could be saved by the Citizen Kane of gaming, Japan was still seen as perpetually behind the times. If my mountain of articles didn't convey this, yo, I only scratched the surface. JRPGs were getting most of the heat, but it's really important to understand that people were kind of dogpiling on all their shit.
Is it what is about Japanese games that inspired us?
Recent.
Recent.
I'm sorry.
They suck. I'm sorry. Like, you guys need to get with the times and make better interfaces and like update your technology. We're totally kicking your ass. Back then, you guys were the king of the world, but your time has passed.
How did we get here, where people think it's bold and unexpected to stick to your roots? And why would anyone even want to celebrate that? The answer lies in the Golden Age. Okay, so, back in the Golden Age, Squaresoft was seen as the powerhouse for RPGs, especially so in America, because many more of their games were localized and actually marketed. Who would have thought? Their big franchise was a game called Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars. And they also had Final Fantasy, and that was doing alright. These were the ambitious RPGs of the day, the technically impressive tentpole games telling the provocative stories like Clown Man Bad, An Alien Wakes Up. Picture the way people talked about Cyberpunk leading up to its release. That's how people talked about Final Fantasy VII. With the help of this Western market dominance, the entire genre became conflated with Square. Turn-based combat, random encounters, world maps, airships, fucking anime. For many, especially those less familiar with any other brands, Final Fantasy literally became the definition of a JRPG. Or more specifically, this kind of JRPG. More on that soon. And as the brand continued to try new ideas and do weirder and weirder and weirder shit, people interpreted that as a direct reflection of the genre's overall health. Despite the fact that this was only one franchise, despite the fact that changing things up is a healthy practice, despite the fact that all of them were independently pretty popular, and reach new audiences that seem to really appreciate them. Despite the fact that this franchise has always been defined by experimentation since day 2. All of this culminated with Final Fantasy XIII. People lost their shit over this game, and I really just can't overstate how much 13's reception tanked any and all conversation around JRPGs for the next decade. You can see this trend where the RPGs people actually talked about were rationalized as exceptions, which started to look really funny when they outnumbered the rule.
But none of the pompousness and melodrama of less accomplished Japanese epics. I'd forgotten that JRPGs could be anything other than depressingly linear and heavily overwritten.
When you have to ask every year if JRPGs are back, maybe they never went anywhere, unless you're Texas football. And I played 13 when I was 12. I really have no love for this game, one way or the other. I think there's some pretty valid critiques to be made against it, but people reacted a certain way. And the root of that outrage is that it was too different. It was held to this standard of what a Final Fantasy game should be, instead of what this Final Fantasy game wanted to be. And I don't think that's ever fair. We should value all games as they are, for the goals they're trying to hit. But it didn't matter. 13 was seen as a flop. And the whole genre just went down with it. Except of course it didn't. Because there is no golden age. There never was. It's another bad gaming buzzword that you should never take seriously. This isn't unique to video games. You can see this anywhere in culture. But the real kicker is that because games are so young, and frankly so unique, we are still figuring out how to talk about them. And it just so happens that many of the voices leading these conversations since, I don't know, the 2000s, were those kids who grew up in what has traditionally been known as the golden age of gaming at large. Gee, I wonder who decided to name it that. You're free to decide if this is a coincidence. Suddenly, you realize it's not where did all the JRPGs go, it's where did all the games I played as a kid go? And that's very different. And that's not to say old games aren't valuable. I shouldn't have to qualify this, but I like the Super Nintendo, and we still feel its influence today. But that influence can also be a burden, because this genre does not need saving, and most of the games that promise to be the cure were trying to solve a problem that didn't exist in the first place.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
I want to apologize in advance, but we have to talk about genre. Wow, I suck. Because here's the sticky wicket. A JRPG doesn't actually need any of these to be a JRPG. And that's where this conversation really gets bogged down, because some people will just be obtuse and tell you that it does.
That makes sense to me.
Then take it.
It's not my wallet.
The only criteria, is it a role-playing game from Japan? And guess what? It's a JRPG. I don't make the rules. But hey, thanks for stopping by. Glad to have you. Video game genres suck. They're already flawed in every other medium, but here they should especially be taken less literally. Genre is a tool that we use to talk about art with similar qualities, and it's useful to the individual because it can help you find more of what you already know that you like. But that connecting thread is a lot broader when it could be not just the tone and themes, but the mechanical gameplay as well. Or literally anything else. Because what the fuck is Luigi's Mansion? Answer: a good game. A big piece of this puzzle is the insistence that these kinds of games, traditional, old school, Dragon Quest clones, whatever, are the true JRPGs. And there is this mindset that as the genre evolved, pure games like these stopped being made. And by the time 13 came along to poison the well,
where has my country gone? Where has my country gone?
what we have now is somehow a bastardization. And that's malarkey. Not only do new very faithful games continue to be made, but the more experimental shit has the same DNA and influence in them. Now, to be fair, there is a specific style of game in question here, but it's inconsistent. It's a very flawed criteria that barely fits its own subgenre and has more to do with the technical limitations of the 90s than anything else. Think about it. How many Golden Age RPGs actually adhere to all of these rules? Chrono Trigger doesn't, and guess what? It's kinda why it's the best one. Not because these are bad qualities, but because it wasn't bound to them like the Bible.
This is the Bible.
It's exactly why you hear people say that JRPGs have changed too much, but are still too samey. We have a paradox. When your definition of a real JRPG is this limited, then the only games that can pass your test are going to be unoriginal and stagnant. There's clearly an audience that still wants to play these kinds of games, including me. But the real issue is that when new releases do try to experiment and actually push boundaries, they either get ostracized for trying to be different, or just completely dismissed as something else entirely. The result is a genre that just can't win.
This stinks! I hate it this way.
What's wrong with it?
Less cheese! More macaroni. Less macaroni. More cheese! More cheese and macaroni. Too much macaroni! Ooh, perfect! I hate macaroni and cheese.
Look, I understand why people want to sort things into these perfect categories, but art just doesn't work that way. It's these rigid buckets that keep people from branching out, because they've already made their assumptions. But genres in general are abstract, and it's that fluidity and willingness to experiment with boundaries that leads to the bold and unexpected. Even if they individually fail, the attempt itself is good for the health of the medium. Ni no Kuni is a conventional genre piece. It evokes this specific idea of the classic JRPG through the world, the music, the tropes. It's not literally the same, but it's intentionally familiar. Even the Ghibli skin is clever because it capitalizes on the iconography that invokes other Ghibli works without having to exist for its own sake. Look, it's the Japanese forest town filled with quirky spirits, because that's what you expected to be there. And if you're someone who likes that style and those tropes, then you'll probably really like this game. There's nothing wrong with that. But let's be real, that's not bold. That's safe and cliched. That's not the kind of game I want to champion as pushing the genre forward or in an interesting new direction, let alone saving it. Ni no Kuni is a genre piece that is content to echo the genre, and it's exactly why I like Bravely Default so much more by comparison. Because this game was packaged and marketed the exact same way, but to the nth degree. This is a spin-off of a Final Fantasy spin-off stamped with Square as the official publisher. The chefs at Silicon Studios made your favorite crust with all the right toppings. And it was a hit! Square admitted it outperformed their expectations, and it was this great proof in the pudding moment that the people were right all along. They rejoiced, long live the golden age, and fuck your modern game design. But all was not how it seemed. Because Bravely Default is the other kind of genre piece, the one that abuses your expectations in order to subvert them. This game that looks like it's justifying the old ways is actually advocating for the exact opposite. Bravely Default is a parody. This game is suspiciously boring, to start at least. It plays out like the most vanilla Final Fantasy clone, and it uses the excuse of tradition to try and cover that up. But when our heroes achieve their goal of lighting the 4 crystals, the world resets. You are functionally back at the start of the game with your main quest undone. This is the most polarizing part of the game, and it's also the real reason I think it's even worth talking about. It's frustrating. You have to refight the same bosses so you can redo the same shit to have it all happen again. What's happening here? You are trapped in a cycle. The game is using itself to show you what stagnation feels like. Everyone says they want the good old days again, but that's the problem, because then we never get anywhere new. The real twist is that it makes you stop and say, wait a second, I actually don't want to keep doing the same thing over and over again. Please stop. And it does that through your hands. It's something you have to realize by engaging with the game. The medium is the message, and it respects you enough to give you the puzzle without telling you to solve for something. And the whole time, the game just loves to beat you over the head with these themes of thinking for yourself and agency of your actions. This is like Idia's entire character. But as the one controlling them, what the fuck are you doing? You only keep repeating the cycle because someone else is telling you to. So what's the answer? You disobey. You let go of the past and do things differently this time. You break the crystal. This twist only works in the first place because our brains have these basic associations. The fairy is good, the world needs the crystals. Games about agency don't actually give the player any agency. The crystals themselves are my favorite symbol because they represent tradition in both the game's world and ours. Crystals are arguably the most recognizable icon of Final Fantasy, this unshakable anchor on the genre. The act of destroying one is a clear rejection of the old ways. And what's cool is the game just doesn't tell you it's possible. You have to figure it out and smash that like button yourself. And it's so cathartic when you do. You feel so fucking smart. Like, it's the greatest reward. So why is this so polarizing? And I think the reason is not the message, but the method. Just because the game is intentionally trying to piss you off doesn't change the fact that you're pissed off. I get it, it's a double-edged sword. But call it the price of being bold. This game wasn't afraid to alienate people in order to deliver its message in a really creative way. I'm the guy who likes Tartarus for the exact same reason. Because when Bae tells me to start climbing, I have achieved true empathy with the party. But it's not nearly the slog that it sounds like, specifically because of how Bravely Default actually modernizes how it plays. The dressing is boilerplate, yes, but everything under the hood is actually turned up to 11. You can fast forward battles, automate attacks, multiply your experience, and adjust the encounter rate to double or none. A feature which has been taboo for all the hardcore gamers, but let me tell you a little secret, makes this game 2 billion% better. It preserves the spirit of the old, but without all the bullshit people like to forget. Kind of making the point in and of itself that the genre doesn't have to be this way. To this day, I've never played an RPG where grinding is faster and easier. The cycle honestly boils down to a boss rush, and I know for a fact you motherfuckers liked boss rushes, so don't even start with me, crack or don't crack. But I can still admit that the execution isn't perfect. I know a lot of people are bothered by the fact that all this cool shit leads to the alternate ending. I totally agree, I think the game would be better if the endings were switched. But none of these themes that I care so much about are actually undermined through the canon ending. It was still the reliance on the crystals that got them into this mess. Their gullibility was still the problem. It does mean a lot more people die though, and that does kind of suck. But I'm so glad they went for it. It's the ideas and themes behind it all that I love so much, and the way they're delivered that I think matters most. And I think it's okay for something to be rough around the edges if it's ambitious enough. When asked about players' expectations of Final Fantasy XIII versus the goals of his team, Yoshinori Kitase once said, quote, "We really didn't intend to work within the RPG template. We wanted to create a new game, even a new genre." And it's this quote about this game that I think really strikes at the heart of this entire clusterfuck. Ironically, Final Fantasy is a franchise that just reinvents itself with every new game. Each change might be bolder today than it used to be, but it's always been that way. It's the franchise's greatest strength and weakness. No matter how much of a success the last game was, the next one is never afraid to say fuck it and just recode the wheel for the 16th time. It means you might really vibe with a few of the games, but none of the rest. And I've always thought that's kinda cool. Dragon Quest is this titan of tradition, while Final Fantasy is changed for its own sake. I may not like every entry, I do not think they succeed every time, but that's admirable. That's an ambitious approach for a mega corporation to take with their mega franchise. Your stance on this idea and sequels in general will totally change how you view this conversation. And I just ask, are you consistent? Would you rather see games try something new and potentially fail, or repackage something familiar that you already know that you like? More importantly, which one do you think is bold and unexpected? And it's not black and white. The line between innovation and imitation can be blurry, but it's my stance that this specific series has always been about reinvention above all else. I know this video is kind of a misnomer, but I just don't think you can talk about Bravely Default and why it's actually special without unpacking at least some of the baggage. There's nothing wrong with nostalgia if you have strong feelings for a game you played as a kid, for any reason. Treasure those. I will never shit on you for that, but you'll never be happy chasing yesterday's highs. Because it's never enough to imitate. What we put on a pedestal must always be challenged. I remember people used to talk about Ocarina of Time as this universal, greatest game ever made. And I like that game more than most people. That's insane to say today. And thank God for that, because can you imagine if we never got past this? Every new year, this medium grows exponentially, and that's what's exciting. Imagine what we consider a golden age to look like in 20, 50, or 100 years from now. This game never tried to throw shade at Final Fantasy. That's the bait. It was pitched as a celebration of the past, and it absolutely still is, but with the caveat that we can't be held down by it. I have no doubts that the developers completely support Final Fantasy XIII, because it's made with that exact same sauce. It's an optimistic reaction to a sea of pessimism, and a reminder that we always have to be pushing for the next great thing. So don't be afraid. Break the crystal, because the best is yet to come.